Whenever I preach, I always take my watch off. Just place it there. It doesn't make me preach any faster. It just gives you hope that you might get home before down to the house. But it also, I've told this joke before, and please indulge me for those who have heard it, but I'm going to tell it again anyway. It just reminds me of a little boy who's in church with his dad, and they're at it's a high church, or Catholic church, and the priest, vicar, and the little boy says, "What does that mean, Dad?" He says, "Well, it's a sign of the cross, in the Father, Son, Holy Ghost." A bit later on, he lifts his arms up like that. "Dad, what does that mean?" He's praising God. Oh, okay. Then, when he comes to preach, he takes his watch off and looks at it. And the little boy says, "What does that mean, Dad?" He says, "Absolutely nothing whatsoever." Yeah, the old ones are the good ones, aren't they? Anyway, good morning.
Good morning.
We do have a few relatively new people in our congregation, and Regan's welcomed them. I will welcome you too. And for your benefit, Regan's mentioned my name. I'm Mike Galligan. Rini Galligan. Well, we've been married 42 years on Tuesday. Man and boy. Okay, if we keep rustling, tell me. Okay. Did you know that there's a plant which is believed to be hazardous to sheep and to birds? And if the sheep gets entangled in the Bible reading, sorry. Just rewind. Bible reading. Sorry, Phil. I've got it at the top here. I know what it is. I know it all. Right, it's from Genesis 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to the servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father, yes, my son." Abraham replied, "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and raised the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over, took the ram, and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and he said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. And Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Thanks. Right, apologies for that. Now you know the significance of the ram. There is, as I said, there is a plant, and I haven't mentioned this in the pod group that we used to be in with Phil. It's a plant that is hazardous to sheep and birds, and if they become entangled in the spines, the animal dies. It can't get away, and so it decomposes. So the nutrients then feed into the plant. So it's actually become known as it's a sheep-eating plant. For the scientists and biologists amongst you, it's called Puya chilensis, and it grows on the hills of Chile. It's a total useless information. But I do wonder if that same plant was growing in Canaan at the time, because it was thousands of years ago. It might have died off since. Things do, don't they? And it might be that this is the plant that the ram had got entangled in. We don't know, but that's something to go with into today. This passage has many, the Bible itself has many difficult passages, and you just think, what's going on there? But this is a real challenging moment when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son. It causes to ask a lot of troubling questions. What kind of God would ask this? Is this request conflicting with everything else God says, or seems to value? If the Bible is a unified story that actually leads to Jesus, then is Jesus connected to such a disturbing request? Is the God of love found anywhere in this passage? And thankfully, the good news to both those questions is yes. So let's have a look at the background to this story. Genesis 1 tells the story of how God created all things, made humans in his image to rule on his behalf. However, humans misuse their rule. The world spins out of control into violence and death. Is that so relevant today? Still? Sadly? This all leads up to the rebellion and scattering of the people from Babylon. So God calls a man who is at the time called Abram, and later to become known as Abraham, to launch his plan to rescue and bless the whole world through Abraham's family. However, there is a problem, because Abraham is childless and his wife is barren. This problem lurks in the background of Abraham's story, but God reaffirms his promise. One day, Abraham will have a son, and his descendants will be a great nation. So after decades of waiting, Isaac was born. But that long wait wasn't Abraham's true test. This comes in the very next chapter that we just read, when God tells Abraham to take his beloved son and sacrifice him. Abraham was so confused. Why would God promise him a son and numerous descendants and then take the son away? At this stage, Isaac does not have any children. His marriage and then his descendants come 2 chapters later. So if he sacrifices Isaac, how does he, Abraham, become the father of many nations? If we look at this story closer, we see 3 things that lead us to a greater understanding of this passage. You see, this was not Abraham's first encounter with God. Previously, he's pleaded with God on behalf of Sodom. God was about to destroy Sodom. But Abraham pleaded with him. God spared Sodom. God had instructed Abraham to leave the land of his fathers, go where God was sending him. So he already knew God personally. He knew his voice, and that's the important thing. So he obeyed God's unexpected command to sacrifice Isaac because he trusted him and knew him to be good and trustworthy. Excuse me, people. There's the word over there, isn't it? Second point is Abraham did not think Isaac would die. It says in Genesis 22:5, he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." So it appears that he was convinced they would both return. Also, when Isaac asked where the lamb was, he replied, "God will provide." Another lesson in that for us, isn't it? In that one sentence, God will provide. It seems that Abraham had already prepared himself that God was going to do something else. And the fantastic passage in Hebrews 11 where he talks about faith, by faith such a way he did this, by faith such a way he do that. It says at verses 17 to 19, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He, who had embraced promises, was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. A third point I've discovered during this research for this sermon is the prophetic reenactment. The story of Abraham and Isaac takes on larger significance when you place it in the context of prophetic reenactment. You see, throughout the Bible, God asked prophets to reenact in miniature what God then does on a larger scale. We may think, how could God have required this? But when we view the story through the eyes of prophetic reenactment, we can ask, what did God intend for us to learn through this? See, the entire Bible points to Jesus, doesn't it? And Genesis 22 really does. Let's think about the parallels between this passage and Jesus. Both Isaac and Jesus are described as beloved sons. At this point, Phil, can I ask you to put verse 6 on again, please? So both Isaac and Jesus are described as beloved sons. They've been waiting for a very long time. Both of them. I love this bit, that's why I felt a bit of talk. He took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son, Isaac. You know, all the years I've heard that story, I've never looked at that bit. He placed the wood for the sons, for the sacrifice. Is that not the parallel of Jesus? Carrying his own cross? Okay, well, thanks. In both cases, the father leaves the son, and the son follows obediently. It was God who provided the sacrifice in both cases. Abraham said God will provide a lamb, and Jesus is described in John's Gospel as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And also, both sons were innocent, but who went willingly up the mountain, and Jesus to be crucified. What do the parallels mean for us? In Abraham's case, an exchange happened in that the ram replaced Isaac. But an even greater exchange was when Jesus went to the cross for our sins. The Son of God in our place. Another thing I love about this passage, it's worth noting that it actually stresses they went to the region of Moriah. Mount Moriah is the very place where many dead years later King David bought the threshing floor of Oldham as a place for the site of the temple. On that very place where Abraham offered Isaac, the Temple of Solomon was built. And this is modern day Jerusalem, and Mount Calvary, where Jesus was crucified, is nearby. So to me, that is saying God will not ask Abraham or us to do what he is not prepared to do himself. We don't know how old Isaac was, but we know he's old enough to leave his mother. He could speak, he could ask intelligent questions and reason. Where is the lamb to be sacrificed? He was able to carry the wood for the fire. So it does make me think that as Abraham was clearly elderly, Isaac may have just been big enough and strong enough to just like, no, yeah, get away, old man. He was bound by Isaac and placed on the wood. Isaac didn't resist. Another parallel in that with Jesus. Jesus was bound, but he didn't resist. He didn't fight back. Again, the Bible doesn't give us any dialogue that goes on between them. But I'd like to think that between the two of them, Abraham was reassuring Isaac, all will be well. As he's piling the wood, as he's binding him, he's saying to him, God will provide. Something else to note in this passage is that it's clear Abraham is in close contact with God. As I said before, he can hear God's voice, he recognises God's voice. He heard God telling him to sacrifice Isaac, and when the angel told him to stop, he also heard that. The test was over, and Abraham had passed with flying colours. And then God reaffirms his promise that he will bless Abraham and his descendants, and his will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Have you tried to count the stars in the sky? Or the sand? Count. Impossible. And Jesus is one of Abraham's descendants. He is the means by which all may come into God's blessing and grace through faith. And it's a good job, isn't it, that he did have a listening ear. I once heard this bit referred to as computer speak. He was getting the updates. Nowadays, anything that's associated as a computer, even a mobile phone, gets updates. I'm frustrated at times because it reboots when you're in the middle of something. It's supposed to make them run more secure and more efficiently. Thankfully, in this passage, Abraham was getting the updates. We can't imagine what would have happened if he was not getting the updates. I'm just wondering here, is God asking us to sacrifice something? One thing for sure, he's not asking us to sacrifice a fellow human. He's done that for us. But there may be something in our lives that we need to give up. Are we getting the updates from God? Are we listening to him? Are we acting on his word? Are we listening to him? It's a good one, isn't it? I can assure you, if that is the case, once we have done it, he will provide. We also read that Abraham renamed the place the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh. We sometimes sing that in church. Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. We sometimes sing it, don't we? Over the years we sing Jehovah Jireh, my provider. Another thing I do wonder is, again, there's no mention of any chat between them, but how did Abraham feel? God said to take his only son, that is the only son by Sarah, and sacrifice him. Remember, Abraham did have another son, but that's when he tried to take matters into his own hands and had a son by the maidservant Hagar. The other son was Ishmael. But he told him to take Isaac. He didn't say take a bullock or a lamb or even a servant, but the son whom he loved. I bet Abraham would have preferred it to have been one of the others rather than sacrifice his son. When they set off, it was on the third day. When they set off, it was on the third day that they arrived at the place of sacrifice. So can you imagine? Abraham trusted God, but it took 3 days to get there. What was he feeling? What was the horrible torment that was going on inside him? This is the first time the Bible mentions a human sacrifice, so Abraham did not have anything else to go off. There was no precedent. There was no Easter. There was no mention of Lazarus yet. No, the miracles in the Gospels. They were thousands of years later. All he had was God's promise and his own trust. But what about Sarah? Presumably Abraham told her where he was going and why. If it took 3 days to get there, presumably it took 3 days to get back. What was she going through? The mental anguish. Why has God asked us to do this? It's not like Abraham could have got his mobile out, took a selfie and sent it back, is it? And said, everything's fine. Or it might be that he didn't tell Sarah. So she's thinking, where's he gone? He's agonising on the way. I'm not going to tell Sarah when I get back. But to face her wrath and to tell her what's happened. How did Isaac feel? We don't know what he was going through at the time. The next time Isaac is mentioned is 2 chapters later when Abraham sends his servant out to look for a wife for Isaac. They get married. Abraham dies. Isaac buried him. The Bible doesn't say that Isaac decided to just say, I'm off and up sticks and, that's what they would do to me. We know that the Bible is warts and all, so it does tell everything. It doesn't cover up all the bad bits. It's not like a Prime Minister's party, is it? I can only conclude that Isaac forgave his father, and he knew that Abraham trusted God, so Isaac did. There is another learning point for us there, that we learn more about God from those who are more mature in their faith. And in doing so, as they trust God, so it rubs off on us. And then we pass it on to those who are newer to the faith than us. But why death at all? Perhaps seeing in this story the larger context of Jesus' sacrifice doesn't relieve your troubling questions, makes them worse. After all, God is still requiring the death of a son. Only this time, it's his own son. Why does death have to be involved at all? Couldn't God just wave his hand and fix things? Why did that have to be a sacrifice? To answer these questions, we need to ponder the entire story of the Bible. In the beginning, God made a good world and created beings in his image to rule it with him. He offered humanity richness of life because it was a life with him, the source of all life. But there was a condition. If humanity turned away from him, they would die, because nothing can live away from God. Yet that is exactly what they chose. See, God didn't introduce death. Humanity did. God's problem and ours is figuring out how to deal with it. God can't pretend death isn't there, because he is life. But we have chosen to live life by our own standards. So the question is, how will death be resolved? And the answer in the scriptures is sacrifice. Sacrifice is the death of one thing so that something else can have new life. One of my favourite verses in the New Testament is in John's Gospel, chapter 12, verse 24. Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. So true in nature, but especially as Jesus was referring to himself. What makes the gospel such good news is that God solves the problem of death, not by demanding the death of everything touched by evil, but by offering himself instead. The result of Jesus' sacrifice means new life for us all. We cut it short at the end of the Bible reading, but it ends with a list of 12 children of Abraham's brother Nahor. One of these children is Bethuel, who will become the father of Rebekah. Abraham's son Isaac will eventually marry Rebekah, and they will father Jacob. Jacob father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Amazing. I love it. What I'm trying to do here is to see beyond the words that we read and put ourselves in the shoes, or more importantly, the sandals of the people featured in this story. If we move forward a few thousand years to the New Testament, this is where things differ, as the Bible does tell us of the different emotions that Jesus experienced. Before, with Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, we don't know. Jesus, we do. We know that he wept at the grave of Lazarus. He got angry in the temple with the money changers. As a cold result of that, it doesn't mean that he's got an excuse to get angry every now and again. It's righteous anger Jesus had. Another thing he felt is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He suffered such anguish, he sweat blood. And then an angel came and comforted him. I often wonder what the angel said or did. Did he just give Jesus a hug? Maybe he didn't say any words. But sometimes, in that, we need words of comfort at times, don't we? When we're going through a tough time, or words of encouragement, or even, yes, that was great, well done. Sometimes words aren't enough, and a hug suffices. We love hugs, don't we, really? Cuddles. What's wrong with that, eh? Yeah. Can I recommend you try it if you don't? It says more than words at times, I really believe it. Also in the garden, the disciples, when Jesus went off to pray, the disciples couldn't stay awake. Remember when they were in the boat in the middle of a storm, Jesus was asleep. They woke him up to help them. Sometimes we only see things one way, don't we? Like the disciples. When you say to someone, hello, how are you? They reply, I'm fine, thanks. And you waited, and how are you? Doesn't come, does it? I remember a story of our daughter Laura. She went to see a friend she hadn't seen for a while. And when she came out, we said, how is she? Oh, she's fine, yeah, she's fine. She doesn't know how I am. Get a picture. But how did the disciples feel when Jesus was arrested? We know that they were frightened, scattered, prepared to deny Jesus. But how did they feel when Judas came up to betray Jesus? Another feeling that Jesus went through was ridicule. And the Roman soldiers whipped him, put a crown of thorns on his head. They ridiculed him. On the cross, people hurled insults at him. He saved himself, he saved others, let him save himself. He felt lonely to the point that he even asked why his father had forsaken him. And I believe that we know about Jesus' feelings and emotions and other emotions that we've not covered. To say that God is telling us, because of how Jesus came to be a human and went through those emotions and feelings and physical suffering, he knows how we are feeling. He understands. And what about Mary? How did Mary feel? Another parallel in the story with Abraham and Jesus. Like Sarah, she prepared for the birth of her son. Not as many years as Sarah, obviously, but she started to prepare for his birth, only to see him being sacrificed. And even when Jesus was a baby, he was presented in the temple to Simeon. Simeon was an elderly person who had been promised by God he would not die until he had seen the Messiah. He was another one getting the updates. Because he said to Mary, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Mary must have remembered those words when she stood at the foot of the cross. Her own suffering must have been horrendous. David's mentioned Lent starts next week, the build up to Easter. Part part of the Easter story is the Last Supper. So next week we will be celebrating communion, which is what Jesus asked us to do in his memory. And just before those events in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it, in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Abraham prepared the altar to sacrifice Isaac, but God provided the ram. God then provided the ultimate sacrifice for us, and next week this altar will be prepared for us so we can celebrate communion. So, how does this apply today for us? On the surface, this appears to be a problem, this passage, but when we see how it fits with the broader context of Scripture, we can see it's one of the clearest stories pointing us towards God's solution to the problem of death in our world. In choosing Abraham, God launches a plan to rescue the world. Abraham's words to Isaac ultimately point to Jesus. God himself will provide the sacrifice. Amen.
Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Turn your eyes to the hillside where justice and mercy embrace. There the Son of God gave his life for us, and our measureless debt was erased. Jesus, to you we lift our eyes. Jesus, our glory and our prize. We adore you, behold you, our Savior ever true. Oh Jesus, we turn Jesus, we turn our eyes to you.